Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are.
Welcome to Books That Make You. I'm your host, Desiree Duffy, and we're talking about books that make you walk into the video rental store and relive the last great decade of cinema, the 1990s. Returning to the show is Scott Ryan, a pop culture historian, an expert on the entertainment industry, and the author of his latest book, as he takes us back to the 1990s in the last decade of cinema. The book analyzes many of our favorite iconic movies, unpacking their cultural impact, the lasting legacy that they have even to today. And it makes us remember a time when film impacted our lives, when things were in many ways simpler, and when it was okay to argue with your friends over what was in the Pulp Fiction briefcase. You remember how we debated movies back then? But it was okay because at the end, we were still friends. Hi, Scott. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. And it's weird how you talk about the 90s like it was a long time ago, but that's impossible. It was just yesterday, wasn't it?
I know, right? I pulled this out of the back of my closet because I wear this camo jacket all the time. But no, you're right. It does seem for folks, maybe of the Gen X age, that it seems like it was just yesterday. But in reality, we're talking over 20 years ago at this point. Can you give us the lowdown, explain the book and explain why you felt it was necessary to write these essays about movies from the 1990s?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the most organic book that I've ever written, as where it's something that really came from me, where most of my other books was something from the outside. But I was just at home one night. I just was in the mood to watch a movie. And I was going through the streaming device, just clicking movie, and I couldn't find anything. I wanted to see something that I hadn't seen before. And everything just looked horrible. And then I stumbled upon the movie Awakenings with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams, directed by Penny Marshall. And I was like, I haven't seen this movie in 30 years. I think I liked it. And I started watching it and I was blown away by it. It was so good. It was so grown up. It took a while for the story to start and it just really inspired me. And so the next night I watched another movie. It happened to be from the 90s. And then I started thinking, and 160 movies and 4 years later, I have a book.
And it's an amazing book. And it has 55 total films that you uncover. You do longer essays and then you have shorter essays toward the end. How did you decide what made the cut? How did you, when you were parsing through all those movies, what was the criteria?
Well, it was really hard. And these are not my favorite movies. I really tried to be objective. And I also really wanted to cover a plethora of genres. That was very important to me because part of my point is that in the 90s, movies were varied and complex. It wasn't just superhero, or sequels and animated films. So I wanted to get a Western in, so you have Unforgiven. I wanted to have an action picture, so you have Terminator 2. I wanted to have a drama, so you have The Prince of Tides. A mafia picture, so we've got Goodfellas. So that was sort of what I did. I made a list of movies, just going through IMDb, and then I watched them. And I was like, okay, can I write about this? There were some movies that I enjoyed, but I didn't have anything to say about them. So there usually was a scene or a moment that I went, okay, like this would never be made today, and here's why. And so that would sort of set me on the path.
I want to dig into the difference between movies in the 90s and why many of these couldn't be made today. But first, when you're talking about that, I pulled open. As you can see, I've marked some things here. I'm going through your book. So this here has the breakdown of the summary of DC and Marvel movie trends in America. And you're showing, I don't know if people can see that. I know a lot of people are listening. But when we see the percent of total box office revenue and how it's just blossomed from the 90s when it was 1% for those superhero, DC and Marvel, the Marvel universe. Not to say there's anything wrong with superheroes, but in the 2020s, it's 25%.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that crazy? 25% of the films are superhero movies. As an example, in the 90s, there are no superhero franchises born in the 90s. Batman with Michael Keaton started in 1989, and they did make Batman sequels in the 90s. And then Spider-Man started in 2002. But within the decade of the 90s, there was not one superhero franchise born. Isn't that crazy when you think of how many movies come out now that is about some dude who can fly?
Yeah, really. And there's lots of women who can fly too.
Women can be dudes. Anyone can be dudes.
True. The point is that, to your point, I should say, in the 90s, with all of these superhero movies, or with no superhero movies, and now we have this draw to them. I'm the biggest fan of Stan Lee, and I love the Marvel Universe. And there are some movies that I absolutely adore. But going back to your original point, in the 1990s, I think that the freedom of expression and artistic design that folks had, the directors had, and the storytellers had. So can you kind of parse out a little bit more the difference in the style and the artistic design of the movies between then and now?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the examples that I like to use is Terminator 2. And that is in my second chapter for 1991. And the reason I love that movie can be early is it's not like I'm against action films. I love Die Hard. I loved Speed. I love Terminator 2. But even within Terminator 2, there's like a complex plot going on. This is about what happens to humanity when we turn ourselves over to AI, shall we say? Or what if we had a device that we carried with us that would let us talk to people all the time and see what they had for lunch? What will that do to humanity? So even in Terminator 2, it's sort of talking about our human nature and what happens when we give up our humanity and turn it over to computers. So almost every 90s movie, and I watched a lot of them, and of course there are some horrible movies, like the percentage is always going to be there. But the movies that rose to the top, the artist had something to say, and no one was judging that artist for having something to say about that. That's the other thing that happens now, is we blame that actor as if he's not playing a character. And these are just fantasies that are coming out on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, the actor is there to deliver lines and to portray a character based on what they see. Yeah, they might be directed, but there's only so much that individual actor can do. It makes me giggle a little inside because just this last weekend, I had the pleasure of watching The Beekeeper. And it made me really think about your book because it was so tropey and it was just so predictable and it was just so, and I just felt like, are they really out of ideas? The Beekeeper? And it had some really good actors in it. And to your point, I'm kind of snickering and giggling at some of the lines they were delivering, but they had no control over it. What do you think about the way we now are just kind of rehashing some of the same stories over and over again, and we don't have that creativity like we once did?
Well, I think there is a fundamental difference, and I don't blame it all on the studios. I think we own part of this as well. So in the 90s, we wanted a movie to make us feel uncomfortable. And one of the films that I pick out to talk about this is a movie called The Ice Storm. And it's probably a movie that is probably not streaming anywhere. It has Tobey Maguire and Kevin Kline and Sigourney Weaver, and it's directed by Ang Lee. So it has a lot of star power to it. But I think it's a movie people have forgotten about. But it's basically set in the 70s, and it's about a key party where these couples in the 70s would go, they put their keys in a bowl, and then the men pull the keys out, or I guess the women pull the keys out, and then they go home with a different husband. And when that scene comes up, you are so uncomfortable watching this film. You're just, because you want to think like, oh, isn't this an exciting idea? This is going to be some sexual romp that I'm watching. But it's a very dramatic film showing what it would be like to share your spouse, and you are uncomfortable watching it. Now they do everything in a movie to make sure you're not uncomfortable. Anything that is going to push you into making you think about something, they're going to take that out of a film because they just want to keep you calm, buy more popcorn, and then go out and buy another iWatch or something. What can keep the populace calm? Don't make them think. And there are several films in this book that would just crush people's heads today if they were watching this. And I want to be crushed in a movie. I either want to laugh till I can't control myself, or cry, or be uncomfortable. Spike Lee is another director that I talk about in the film. He always pushed your buttons, and it's good to feel that way.
It is. And actually, I think one of the last essays in your book is about Eyes Wide Shut. So
Right.
Talk about feeling that sense of being uncomfortable. Okay, we teased it just a little bit in the beginning. Pulp Fiction is another one. And you talk about great directors. Quentin Tarantino is one of them too. And this whole idea too. So you talk about not being comfortable, but there was a certain amount of debate and dialogue that it seemed like you could have back in the 90s, and you can't have that today, right?
Well, it's funny because in some ways, all we have is people screaming their opinions on Twitter, or, I'm never going to call it X. It'll be Twitter till I'm off the planet. But back in the 90s, you actually listened to the other person. And one of the things that I love to bring up to people is the idea that when you went to a video store and you went with your friends, you had to pitch your movie to the other friend to get them to want to see it. So I might be like, hey, let's watch Pulp Fiction. And they're like, I don't like John Travolta. I thought Look Who's Talking was stupid. And you're like, no, this isn't Look Who's Talking. Like, this is a new John Travolta. And then you're pitching your movie and they're pitching theirs, but you agreed and you guys walked out with that movie. And sometimes you saw a movie that you didn't expect to see. Whereas now we just live in our bubbles, and it's like either you love Pulp Fiction or I'm not going to follow you. I'm not going to be your friend. And, that's crazy. It's a movie.
Pleasantville is another movie that you discussed a little bit. And it's interesting because that also reflects the societal shifts that we've had in pulp culture. How you break people out of that comfort zone, like you said, with a movie like Pleasantville, right?
Yeah, and I loved picking Pleasantville because there is a lot of special effects in that film. For people who don't remember that movie, it stars Reese Witherspoon and Tobey Maguire, and they get sucked into their television and put back in an old 50s sitcom. And the whole movie is in black and white. But as they bring what was then the 90s, which was current, when they bring their freedoms that they've developed, things start to pop into color. And it's such a cool movie because at that point, everything was in computer graphics. So one of the things I like to point out about that is I'm not saying you shouldn't have special effects in movies, but use it to tell a story in an interesting way, not just to kill someone or blow something up, which is how we use things to so many of the movies now. And I think Pleasantville is a great example of a movie that sounds like it's just going to be this stupid teenage movie. Like, what? They're sucked into their television. But it talks a lot about sexual awakenings, racism, the pursuit of art, how a mob mentality works. I mean, there is a lot of lessons to be learned from Pleasantville. It's a very surprising, good film.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it just underscores the point of how in the 90s, the films were just so much different. And in writing this book, too, you've had maybe a lot of behind the scenes revelations, and you've talked to different people, too, industry giants like Patricia Arquette and Alexander Payne. What kind of revelations did some folks distill into you?
I mean, I feel so blessed to have talked to these people. For me, the greatest interview in the book is Helen Childress, who wrote Reality Bites. It's always been one of my favorite movies. And it's the only movie she ever wrote. So she doesn't think of that movie as a success for her because she didn't get to have a whole life of being a screenwriter, which I think she really wanted to. So for me as a writer to get to talk to someone whose writing inspired me and for them to not really feel like they wrote something good was, I don't know. It was interesting because to me, she's like a giant and she doesn't feel that way. And I think there's something about a writer appreciating a writer that makes this nexus. And I really thought Helen and I were going to become best friends. And I don't know. I mean, she hasn't invited me over for dinner yet. So I don't know if we did, but in my mind, we're best friends.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, in the 90s, you felt a certain affinity. You felt like you knew these people, even television. I know we're not talking about television here, but I think that might have been part of the appeal of television shows like Friends that are making this comeback today or have made a comeback because you truly felt like you were friends with these people. There was a certain connection that you had with them.
Yeah. And I mean, what I talk about so much, and probably every one of these movies, is character. And if you're going to create a new character, it's going to take you 20, 30 minutes in the movie before we're bonded with them. The way studios handle that now, if I make Batman the star, I don't need to introduce Batman, although Lord knows they always do. I mean, I've seen Batman's parents die in about 75 different variations. Like, look, we know the Joker killed Batman's parents. You've told us in 12 movies. That's not developing a character. It takes time, and once we bond with that character, Awakenings is a great example. The Robin Williams character is in the first 20 minutes, and he's not even working with Robert De Niro yet. Dances with Wolves. Kevin Costner doesn't get to the reservation till I think it's something crazy, like a half hour into the film. Like you see his backstory, and that makes us care about these characters. And that's, it may not seem connected to Friends, but it is. We care about Chandler. You know what Chandler's going to say. You know how Ross is going to react to something. And that's harder to do in an original 2-hour movie. And so people just stop trying.
Yeah. Or in some cases, they will nail it. I have to give props. You talk about Batman. I just keep thinking about the Joker. But that was basically going back and discovering his character and what made him into who he was. And that's why I think that part of what made that movie such a big hit.
Yeah, and then it comes to the thing where people say, but that's not a superhero movie. And it's like, but yeah, it is. Like, it still is the same thing. Yes, they're trying to make varied superhero movies. But a movie like Eyes Wide Shut that you had brought up, like, where is something that's that creative and that outside of the box? Even for me, I've seen that movie many times since the 90s. That was probably the essay I was the most scared to write because it is a complex movie and I'm not smart enough to explain to you what Eyes Wide Shut is about. I don't think anyone is. But isn't that the fun? Because you might see it totally different than me. And how exciting is that?
Oh, that's true. The fact that the audience is left to have their own interpretations in so many ways, that is what's magical, rather than just spoon feeding the exact story plot. This is the message. This is the morality. Okay, I'm going to take a shift with you. I want to talk about going from film to digital. Can you maybe reflect on that transformation from 35 millimeter into digital film production?
Yeah, I mean, that's another way. I've had some people like sort of get, I don't know, a little snippy with me about the last decade of cinema. Like, really, it was the last decade? Well, it really was the last decade of using 35 millimeter. Now, there are every once in a while, like Quentin Tarantino did Hateful Eight in 70 millimeter, which was like a really big deal. I mean, it can happen sometimes. But in the 90s, all of these films were shot on 35 millimeter. And that was used all the way back from the beginning of film starting. What happened at the end was a little movie called The Phantom Menace, where George Lucas hid a couple digital scenes in that movie to see if he could get away with it. Like, would audiences notice? And no one noticed. And even to this day, and I really tried for the book to find out, no one really knows what scenes they are. Like, there are people who will kind of say, well, we think it was this shot or that shot. I couldn't find direct proof of what it really was. But by 2002, George Lucas said, if you don't have a digital projector, you can't show Attack of the Clones, which was the second Star Wars movie. So all those malls that were showing these beautiful films had to get a digital projector, or they couldn't show what was going to be the biggest movie of 2002. Once you do that, what options do you have but to make another movie that's all digital and another character that's like Jar Jar Binks or all of these digital things? And it pretty much just signified the end of film. And if you're doing that, why not create a character on computer? Why, do something with just a love story like The Bridges of Madison County with Clint Eastwood and Meryl Streep that's just so beautiful about these two older people falling in love? Why does, you know what I mean? If I paid for this digital projector, give me some special effects, give me some stuff. And I think that really had a big causation of ending those kind of films.
I agree. And I've done it myself for more than a decade now. When deciding what films to go see in the theater, it has to be something that's got lots of booms and bangs. Otherwise, I'll just wait for it. I'm not that impatient to go see those classics. But to your point, maybe I should be. Maybe we all should be. Maybe we should have that experience of sitting in the cinema and just watching something for the sake of watching a great film without waiting for the big booms.
Well, and I'll tell you, one of my favorite parts of the book, and I feel like it's the chapter everyone's going to skip the most, but it is on The Prince of Tides, which is a movie probably people think, what, Barbra Streisand's in that? Like, I don't want to hear that, or just think it's like a singing movie, which it isn't. She doesn't sing in it at all. She just directs it. But I talk about seeing that movie in the theater back in 1991, and there's a very dramatic scene in it. And I saw it in a sold-out crowd, and no one made a sound. You could actually hear everyone breathing in and breathing out because you are so riveted by Nick Nolte's performance. And I would submit that that moment is so much better in a theater than any explosion and any digital effect, because you are all of us. I'm sitting here crying with 100 strangers. That's really incredible. And we don't do that now. We don't have those moments of community. And I talk a lot about that in the book, about how important that is to have emotional moments with strangers in a dark room. Like, that's crazy.
Emotional moments with strangers in a dark room. There
I said emotional.
I know you did. Very good. Very good. Well, and you're bringing us to another side of this too, because you do go into a lot of romantic comedies, and the 90s was great for rom-coms and just making things a little bit lighter and more fun. But yet there are many of them that had poignant messages too, right?
Right. Like Pretty Woman is a great example. I think people will be like, what? He's writing a 4,000 word essay on Pretty Woman? But there's a lot to study. I mean, people want to remember that it's Julia Roberts, like getting her hand caught in a necklace thing. But, the B plot of that movie is Richard Gere buying companies and shutting them down and laying people off. And that was the amassing of the wealth that happens through the 90s to create the 1% that we're all talking about now. There's some serious things in Pretty Woman. So even the rom-coms were about something. It's not just about him falling in love with a sex worker. And it's very funny. It's not like you focus on that. But the point is, they didn't just put, it's not just a dumb romantic comedy. I actually compare it to The Way We Were, not to go back to Barbara, but, that's one of the most famous romantic films. And the subplot of that is being blacklisted from Hollywood. And you have to do that in a rom-com. If you're really going to care about these characters, you connect them to something important that we can get behind.
And to your point, in many ways, they couldn't make a movie like Pretty Woman nowadays because of the fact that she was a sex worker, and there would be all sorts of inappropriateness or perceived inappropriateness in the message that is given there. Totally. And I just want to say something too. I think you mentioned the snapping point. I think that was improv, wasn't that?
Yes, it was. Yeah, right. There's so much of that movie which is what I kind of go, and I did a lot of research for that. And I think people who have seen the movie a lot of times and might think they know everything about Pretty Woman. I certainly learned a lot about it. And it was actually based on a very, very dark script that was based on Wall Street, the 1980s movie, that has that grittiness and darkness. And then they made Pretty Woman because Gary Marshall is like a comic genius, and he wanted to lighten the tone a little bit.
Okay, let's take a look ahead. Tell me, Scott, what advice would you give for today's up-and-coming filmmakers, or for the people right now in Hollywood that are trying to decide if AI should be writing their scripts or not? What do you want to say about the future of cinema?
Man, I want to believe that we have hope and that we're coming out of it. And a lot of people are saying that the movies aren't doing as well, the superhero movies, and it's going to end. I don't know what's going to do it. I mean, I think we need someone like Quentin Tarantino to come out of this and bust it open. Obviously not him. It has to be someone young. It has to be someone from Gen Z who has studied movies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s and wants to go back to that time. And then someone has to be brave enough to give him the money to do it. Wouldn't it be great if Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese and these people who made all this money back then would fund these movies for a new filmmaker to step forward? But it's not going to happen from a corporation. It's just not going to happen.
No, it has to come from the heart, from somebody who cares, who sees the art for what it is. All right, you mentioned Quentin Tarantino again. What, Scott? What was in the briefcase? Pulp Fiction. What was it? What was it?
It was gold. Come on. It was gold.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, come on. I mean, what else would it be? It all comes back to money. I love Pulp Fiction so much. I mean, it really did change my life. And I'm so glad that I got to do a book that has that movie in it. I think 1994 is the best year of cinema ever. So that's my pick.
All right. And one more thing I want to bring up before I let you go is there's an audiobook version of this book as well, right?
And I feel like that, I know I'm supposed to be like pushing my book because that's what authors do, but I have to say that in my writing, I like to, I tell a lot of jokes out of nowhere. That's sort of my way of writing. And I feel like my sarcasm really comes out in the audiobook. Like a lot of me definitely comes out there. I mean, especially my last chapter, it's called Fear Conquers Art. That's probably the most passionate thing I ever wrote. When I listened back, I was like, man, I ought to be winning some award for this. Like, I'm really laying it all on the line. So you can get that. And I promise you will laugh while you listen to it or read it.
I love it. And I've laughed while I read it. And I also laugh while I listen to you. And I know that you're touching me and everybody who reads or listens to the book. You have a great presence, a great mind, and such amazing insights. Scott Ryan, give us your details. Tell people where they can go to find out more about you online and find not only the last decade of cinema, but your other books as well.
Yes, you can go to tuckerdspress.com. That is my publishing company that I run with David Bushman. We have that in Fayetteville Mafia Press. And you can follow me on Twitter at Scott Luck Story. And then on Instagram, I think I'm like 90s movies or something. I actually forget what the handle is, but I'm sure I'll come up if you search for Scott Ryan on Instagram. And I look forward to the day when there is no social media.
Right. We need to get back into the theater and cry over Prince of Tides.
We definitely do. And put your phone down when you watch a movie.
Absolutely. Scott Ryan, thank you again. And thank you, everybody, for being with us today on the Books That Make You show. You can find out more about us on our website. It is booksthatmakeyou.com. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. For those of you who are listening right now, you can always watch the show and see some of the wonderful chalkboard drawings and the books and, watch that way as well. Make sure you ring the bell, subscribe, and never miss an episode of the Books That Make You show. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our Webby Award-winning Books That Make You newsletter. Until next time, all of my bookish buddies, please enjoy all of the books that make you exactly who you are.
The host and executive producer of the Books That Make You show is Desiree Duffy. Sound mastering and engineering by Dave Napox. Social media and content promotion by Siddhi Jahagirdar. Copywriting and editing by Mike Robinson. The Books That Make You show is an award-winning podcast produced by Black Chateau Enterprises.